Hello and welcome back. I'm the teacher and welcome to Canterbury Cathedral, or at least the main gate of it. Now, the Canterbury Cathedral has been featured in a lot of parts of history. Founded in 597, given a lovely little redo between 1017 and 1077. And given a lovely little expansion during the 1100s, Canterbury Cathedral has been witness to a lot of sections of history, most particularly the era of the Plantagenets. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, was of course murdered here on the accidental orders of the first Plantagenet king, Henry II. Meanwhile, Edward the Black Prince, son of Edward III and father of Richard II, is of course entombed, enshrined, encapsulated, wait no, not the last one, here. And you can even see the Plantagenet seal right up there. The red and the blue one right there, their lovely seal. Although that one came about during the 100 Years' War, so that was more towards Edward III. Now before, when we've discussed the Plantagenets, we've discussed them more towards the end of their dynastic rule with the Black Prince. But what are endings if we don't discuss the beginnings as well? Which is why we also need to discuss the beginnings of the Plantagenet dynasty, with really the prime example of a king in both virtue and vice, as we discuss Richard I, or as he's better known, Richard the Lionheart. How did I get here?
But first we need to get a smidge more context by looking at the Lionheart's father, Henry II. Henry II had only one goal: to establish and maintain a Plantagenet empire. One that would span long after him, with one of the key components to that being succession.
He and Eleanor of Aquitaine had 8 children, and while not all of them survived to adulthood, Henry at least had 3 sons to succeed him, and as is traditional, his oldest son was set to succeed him, and that was Henry the Younger. Yes, Richard was the middle child of the family. Born in 1157, he was more at home in southern France than in England, being the closest to Eleanor, which is why it was decided that while Henry the Younger would rule England, Richard would inherit the Duchy of Aquitaine as well as Poitou.
Yeah, if only it were that simple.
King Louis VII of France had a vested interest in Aquitaine, not only on the premise of landship, but also due to briefly being betrothed to Eleanor himself. Henry opted to be diplomatic, offering that Aquitaine would swear patronage to France first before England, sweetening the deal by marrying Richard to Louis's daughter, Alice.
And so we got Henry III after Henry II, and Richard became Duke of Aquitaine. And that was the end of that. But not for long!
Henry the Younger was anointed as king in 1170, with Henry VII continuing as High King.
Like making your son the regional manager while you are general manager.
Henry the Younger, being one of the most powerful young men in the world, pulled a Joffrey and took the power to his head, becoming greedy and selfish. Although he was called king, he held no real power, or holdings, or profits despite his titles.
Why do I get the feeling he would be on TikTok?
This all came to a head in 1173 as he approached manhood, as the then 6-year-old John was entering marriage.
I mean, obviously.
Henry II sought to gift his son with 3 castles: Chinon, Loudun, and Mirbeau. Can you tell I failed French? With Chinon in particular being of key strategical significance. Henry the Younger saw this as an affront and a theft from his birthright. You know what that means?
Rebellion!
With his 2 brothers, Richard and Geoffrey, and his mother, Eleanor, joining him.
Why the then 15-year-old Richard sided with his older brother is up to anyone's guess, but if we look at why Eleanor of Aquitaine sided with Henry the Younger, it would shed, I think, a bit more context.
There were many reasons and theories that people threw out over the years. A secret vying for power, a cold response to adultery, or some Oedipal situation, all of which seem outlandish. The more substantial reasoning was simply a land dispute. Since the days of bearing children had passed, Eleanor's days had been spent governing Aquitaine and preparing Richard to take her position. Henry II, however, frequently used portions of Aquitaine to bargain or make deals, such as Gascony or Toulouse. Eleanor not only worried therefore, for the stability of Aquitaine, but also the birthright of her son, who risked inheriting only pieces of Aquitaine. Given Richard's age, it may be likely that he did not realise the wider context, only knowing the surface-level information, yet following along with his brothers and mother. The rebellion lasted for about a year, with Eleanor being captured shortly into the conflict, while the sons were joined by Louis VII, who longed to see Henry's ambitions cut short. But in short, Henry was the better general, soon overwhelming Louis's forces and leading into surrender. Henry sought amnesty with his sons, gifting them their titles and lands back, as well as gifting them with extras for this little object lesson in patience, with Richard being gifted 2 mansions in Poitou and half of its annual revenue.
Well, certainly, it quelled the physical conflict, and by all means, it gave Henry greater honours. But it didn't really quell the actual tension that existed between himself and his sons.
Henry the Younger was still as immature and selfish as ever, with admittedly no opportunities to learn proper leadership or responsibilities to take on board. His only real pastime included sport and jousting, which only attributed to his big head. Meanwhile, Richard spent the time since the rebellion learning to govern Aquitaine and sharpening his keen military mind, doing what, in fairness, Henry the Younger should have been set up to do. With this tension still existing and the world moving on quickly, by 1182 Henry II had to act. He had his 3 eldest sons meet at Le Mans to all get on the same page. As Henry sensed his time was running out, Louis VII had been succeeded by Philip II. Henry's age was catching up with him. He had to make sure that Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey were prepared.
And, yeah, they were not.
It first began with all 3 sons being asked to swear fealty to England, but Richard could not, as he was loyal to the French king first. Besides, swearing loyalty to England included his older brother, who had been posturing around and tried to start trouble with the lords of Aquitaine, starting fires that Richard had to clean up. The tension spilled outwards into argument that eventually spiraled into revolt. As Richard returned to Aquitaine to fortify his defences, Henry II stood firm with his middle son, as Henry the Younger attacked Richard.
Henry the Younger only proved why he was a terrible choice for the crown.
Showing appalling behaviour at every turn, arguing with his father frequently, having his soldiers openly steal from townspeople, clergymen, churches, shrines, trying desperately to rally the lords of Aquitaine against Richard and Henry II to little avail.
It would be higher powers that saw to Henry the Younger this time. In June 1183, Henry the Younger contracted dysentery and died very quickly. A violent, messy end for such a messy young man.
Henry II was of course grief-stricken, but he had business to attend to. In 1183, Henry instructed Richard to hand the Duchy of Aquitaine to John, making it clear that he wished for Richard to become heir to England. But Richard had other ideas. He did not wish to hand control of Aquitaine, his domain, to anyone else. By late 1184, Henry put his hands up and relented, preparing to instead make John heir apparent, while gifting Brittany to Geoffrey, and left Richard to his own devices. But Richard did not agree with this either.
So if he did not want John to take either England or Aquitaine, why? Most likely it was an extrapolation of recent history. John was about 18 at the time of when all of this was happening, and as a result had no real experience in governance, much like Henry the Younger, and we know what happened there. All of this caused Henry to, well, lose his cool, and call on the big guns. Mother.
Eleanor of Aquitaine was brought in from her imprisonment and made to convince Richard to give the Duchy of Aquitaine back to her, or rather, to Henry. Richard relented.
There was no real clear successor, and so Henry had no choice but to just stew and ponder. But fate would force his hand.
Geoffrey encountered an accident during a tournament in August of 1866, ending his life. With only 2 male children left, Henry had a decision to make. Richard had proven himself as a firm leader with ample experience and military knowledge, but Henry favoured John, who he was closer to and had more of a political mind than his older brother. Meanwhile, Richard was restless. He was eager to journey to the Holy Land, as the Crusades had begun again, but couldn't until the succession succession crisis was solved. King Philip of France saw the growing divide between father and son and exploited it, invited Richard to stay in Paris in summer 1187. A friendship was brokered between the two, one which Philip II used to sow seeds of doubt in Richard. It finally came to a head in 1188 when Henry and Philip declared war on each other over the territory of Berry in Toulouse. At the peace talks held in Bonmoulins, Richard outright asked his father of his assurance of inheritance to the kingdom, to which Henry said nothing, a silence that rang through with meaning. Richard therefore had no choice, and so Richard paid homage to Philip II on behalf of Aquitaine and Normandy.
Yeah, knowing where things went, that may not have been the smartest play.
The war raged on for a year. In that time, Richard aided Philip in military strategy and tactics, a betrayal to the old king, and a strain on his weakening frame, all culminating at Le Mans in June 1189. The forces defending the fortress were unprepared for the surprise attack, and in desperation sought to smoke the invaders away by setting fire to the suburbs, a plan that only succeeded in setting their own forces ablaze. This forced Henry II to retreat, and with the last of his strength leaving him, he gave up. He sequestered himself at Chinon Castle, and by July, Philip came to his door, making several demands, which amounted to Henry's total surrender and the guarantee of Richard's succession. Henry acquiesced to all demands. Weakened, betrayed, crumbled to ash, Henry II's life ended in calamity, as he passed on the 6th of July, 1189. Although the events between 1187 and 1189 were difficult, they had borne fruit. Richard was now King of England, and more importantly, he was free to join the crusade and fight against Saladin. Richard sought to take up the sword for the Holy Land, not only as a Christian, but also as a family member, for Sybil, Queen of Jerusalem, was his cousin by their mutual ancestor Volk V of Anjou.
So Richard was as eager as anyone to jump in and join the fray, but there were still two key matters he had to deal with before he could set sights on the Crusades.
Crowned in September 1189 at Westminster Abbey, Richard almost immediately began to prepare, stockpiling and buying necessary equipment and provisions, spending a small fortune in his first year, with £14,000 spent.
Which in today's money is £35 million.
The recruitment drive was also as extortionate, with able-bodied men being told that a tour of the Crusades would forgive their immortal soul for past sins. Henry II, before his death, had raised about £100,000 for the crusade, but that was only the beginning for Richard. The new king was as ambitious to raise money as he was to spend it, selling everything but the kitchen sink, where his father had been shrewder and more calculating in his sales and acquisitions. With that done, Richard needed to act with Philip II. Philip II wanted to attend the Crusades, but with both countries leaderless, there was worry that either of the two or another would attack their respective lands, and so they agreed to a mutual defense pact, basically stating that they would not attack one another and would defend the other one if they came under attack from a third party. The barons of each respective country were ordered to maintaining the running of the place and keep things moving, but both kings knew each other well enough to anticipate things going south. The only problem remaining was the then 22-year-old John. John would be staying in England, and by their father had been promised £4,000 worth of land. Richard had to acquiesce and gifted him with the earldoms of Derby, Nottingham, Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Dorset, and a handful of castles, as well as marriage to Isabel of Gloucester. With all of this, John could easily destabilize the government if he wanted to, and Richard knew it. He employed a council of loyalists to govern in his absence, as well as set Eleanor of Aquitaine on the case in the hope that they could all keep John in line.
With all of this sorted, Richard I set off for the Holy Land in June 1190, with a sword said to be the legendary Excalibur at his hilt. Richard I was set to become the Lionheart. But first, shenanigans.
Travelling and making stops at several ports along the way, plundering loot from several towns and villages, enough to make a massive impression by the time he reached Sicily. This caused a certain amount of annoyance from Philip, who wanted a quieter, more prepared journey to, war. But if Philip was annoyed now, he would have to prepare himself for Richard's next piece of news. Marriage to Philip's sister Alice was off.
The two had been betrothed as children, and Alice had remained at the court of Henry II for years. It's difficult to say how well they got on, but there were rumours of dalliances between herself and Henry.
This was a bitter but understandable pill to swallow for Philip, and just in time, as Richard's actual bride was on her way. In early 1191, Eleanor of Aquitaine arrived in Sicily with the then 18-year-old Berengaria of Navarre. Taking all of this in, Philip II left Sicily affronted and enraged at the turn of events, taking 10,000 marks as compensation before continuing on. The plan from here was to have Joan of Sicily, Richard's sister, take over as chaperone for Berengaria as the party continued onto the Holy Land. But a storm kicked up and split the naval force, so that while Richard and his forces arrived at Rhodes, Joan and 25 other ships were blown to Cyprus.
But not to worry, Cyprus was an independent Greek state. And hey, the Greeks are lovely people, and this was the royal procession, a king on guard. The king on his way to the Holy Land to complete a holy Christian mission. Nothing could go wrong, right? Everything will be fine. Until it wasn't.
The then King of Cyprus was anything but welcoming. Isaac Comnenus was a tyrannical ruler who sought to capture Joan and...
Look, I'm just calling her B for short now.
For his own purposes. Once Richard caught wind of this, he knew it was side quest time, as his forces landed at the coast of Limassol, pushing back the forces of Cyprus through the streets, until the army was pushed back to Famagusta. In celebration of this resounding victory and capture of the town, Richard married his new fiancée. He and Bee were married on the 12th of May, and she was crowned the new Queen of England. With this done, he soon spent the next 3 weeks capturing the rest of Cyprus, until finally he had the tyrant Comnenus cornered. His will to fight broken. He gave up without much fight. Wanting money more than lordship, Richard promptly wrote home, telling of his captures and plunder of Cyprus, before selling the island to the Knights Templar.
But now it was time to finally reach the Holy Land.
His force landed at Acre in June 1191, and already the land had seen its share of war. The skies were dark with arrow and rock fodder. The smell of rotting putrefaction permeated the air. A siege had been ongoing for over a year. Philip himself had been there for months, fighting against the Muslim forces led by Saladin. On the outside, Richard's arrival, with his wealth, strong and eager men to swell the armies, and a fresh-faced king could only be a godsend. But there was nothing but tension between Philip and Richard. The old rivalries had only transferred to the battlefield, and if that wasn't enough, Richard soon fell ill with a scurvy-like disease known as Arnaldia, a disease which ravaged his body, weakening him, causing his teeth and fingernails to fall out, and his hair to fall out in clumps.
But if you thought that this would quell his resolve, you've clearly not been paying attention.
Richard continually sent correspondence to Saladin, brokering to meet and discuss amnesty,
as well as send ice for his fever.
with Saladin not meeting him in person, but learning to respect this new player in the game, while Richard also had his staff support him as he took to the front lines. While the siege of Acre intensified, armed with a crossbow, he shot at the defending Muslim soldiers, killing some and inspiring his men onwards. Finally, in July, the siege broke through. Saladin managed to barter a bloodless siege by paying for a ransom. It was a momentous entry into Acre after nearly 2 years of struggle. Flags waved for both the English and French. 3 cheers all around, but for every high there is a low. Richard, Joan, and Bee moved into the royal palace of Acre, where Richard made the affront of tearing down the livery of Duke Leopold of Austria, an ally of the Crusaders. This was seen as an insult, especially by Philip, who had enough of Richard's ways. Insulted and humiliated by Richard at every turn, he proclaimed that he had fulfilled his obligation to the cause and sailed for France. Richard could not be happier. Now he could cut loose and not have to share the glory with anyone.
And once again, if only things were that simple. With the mount With the cat away, the mouse could play, although that phrase seems like an insult to mice in this context.
John had been instructed to stay out of England for 3 years while the king was away, an order that John almost immediately broke. He took the first opportunity to take over the elected council of loyalists, becoming supreme governor of the realm, having deposed and ruined the reputation of former head William Longchamp. Richard heard of all this in April 1192. Fortunately, Richard had planned for this and put in motion contingencies to mediate, but these went from bad to worse in May as John began to plot with Philip II, the returned French king, with a grudge. Time was against Richard, as he knew John could do enough damage to the crown without the support of France. Richard decided to stay only for one final season and hopefully have a kingdom to return to.
But if only the Crusades were cooperating!
There was dispute after dispute over who would lead the Holy Land after the war. Failure and infighting followed a summer march, as stalemate beckoned. In July 1192, while Richard was away in Beirut, Saladin's army attacked the sea town of Jaffa, a central port of trade for Jerusalem and a key strategic point for the Christians. They were successful in their siege, and Saracen claimed Jaffa. What would ordinarily be a signal of defeat, but not for Richard. He led a small flotilla of men by nightfall, and in a surprise attack, beat back the Saracens out of Jaffa, cementing his military reputation of snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. But it was a brief victory. Both sides were quickly becoming unsustainable, and as Richard himself said to Saladin, "You and we together are ruined." The two agreed to a 3-year truce. Saladin would keep Jerusalem, while the Crusaders kept all that they had conquered from Tyre to Jaffa. A certain number of Christian pilgrims would be allowed into and out of the Holy Land, and the true cross pieces would be kept by Saladin. Although the two had never met in person, there was still a degree of respect for one another. Although Richard had to leave the Holy Land, he wrote to Saladin that one day he would return to end the crusade, and Saladin replied that there was no other king he would accept losing his empire to.
In October, Richard set sail for England. He did not know what he would find once he returned to England. By all accounts, the Crusades had been a failure, but they had cemented something. A legend, born on the battlefield. The legend of the Lionheart.
Although Richard was a military hero, he was anything but beloved, having insulted Philip II by refusing to marry his sister, insulted Leopold of Austria, deposed Isaac of Cyprus. Every major player in Europe had an axe to grind against the Lionheart, making the journey home almost impossible. Richard gathered his men and ordered a path north, but the November winds shipwrecked the naval force, stranding them in Istria.
They would have to then travel on foot through Central Europe. A small army and the most recognizable king in the world traveling through lands ruled by people that hate their guts. Seems easy.
3 days into the journey, near Vienna, Richard was spotted and handed to Leopold of Austria,
Well, who saw that coming?
who then sold him to Emperor Henry VI of Germany in February 1193. Richard was held in house arrest. They could not place Richard in a traditional dungeon due to, such factors as him being a king and the Pope not allowing it. How long Richard would be incarcerated for was anyone's guess, but if anything was certain, it was a weasel sneaking out for cheese. John sought an opportunity to seize the crown of England outright, doing homage to Philip II and promising to marry the spurned Alice, before turning back to England to raise a rebellion. Fortunately, there were cool heads in the country, like Eleanor of Aquitaine.
This whole saga is basically just Eleanor of Aquitaine carrying the crown on her back.
Not to mention that kings such as William of Scotland refused to raise arms against Richard in any capacity, while the Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, refused to support John, as the king was still in power, but just needed assistance. A ransom was needed for Richard's freedom, one which tapped all the reserves and revenue streams of the country, but one that was raised nonetheless. Despite John's desperate seizing for power, a ransom of 100,000 marks was raised for Richard's release, along with 50,000 more for hostages, and by February 1194, the king was freed, just in time, as Philip II wrote to John desperately saying, "Look to yourself, the devil is loose."
Finally landing home after 4 years, King Richard landed in Sandwich. I think he needed a sandwich after all of that. What would he do now? It was time to get to work stabilizing the country.
After very quickly stamping out the embers of John's plans, before promoting Hubert Walter, his trusted friend and ally, as the new head of government. With this done, the battlefield cooled once more, this time closer to home in France.
Richard knew of Philip's collusion with his brother John, and so it was time to let him know. The king was back.
This required another round of revenue and tax collection for the war chests. And while this was once more a hefty burden for the country and Normandy to bear, the people still had faith in their lion-hearted king and knew it was going to a worthy cause, sailing from Portsmouth to Barfleur in May 1194, and in the process granting a charter and beginning the building of a town for Portsmouth, making it a valuable military port in years to come. It would be a steep battle ahead. Philip, on his return from the Holy Land, had been collecting and fortifying his power, and with the aid of John, Henry VI, and the switched allegiance of fence-sitting lords, Philip's forces were overrunning the country.
One would have thought, after all of the mess that John had made, that Richard would call him an enemy, that would call him a traitor, that would imprison him, that would torture him, that would permeate him into exclusion, but instead, he forgave his brother. Why? Perhaps it was on Eleanor's advice. Perhaps she knew that the family was stronger together than divided. Sure, John was slime and a traitor, as well as a rat. But if he was their rat, then maybe that would make all the difference.
The battle raged on. Both were more evenly matched than first thought. Although Philip had built up his forces, Richard was a warrior born and led his army through the torrent to follow. But soon Philip had an ace up his sleeve in the form of Arthur of Brittany, Richard's nephew by way of the departed Geoffrey. In the 6 years they had been married, Richard had no children, and John had proven himself as poor for the logical heir presumptive. In early 1196, Richard had recognized this and asked for Constance, Arthur's mother, to send the boy to his court. She refused, and so Richard tried to storm the castle of the Britons. The Britons did not take well to this, and sent Arthur to Philip's court instead. Things, however, began to turn Richard's way. Richard began to embargo on Anglo-Flemish commerce, which weakened Philip's allegiance with Baldwin, Count of Flanders. An upswing that was cemented by the construction of a new fortress, Chateau Gaillard, 5 miles away from the French stronghold of Gaillon. It formed a defensive line between Normandy and Portsmouth, a defiant cementation of Richard's military supremacy, and quickly becoming his favourite base. All this made Philip call for a year-long ceasefire in autumn 1197, with things only going from bad to worse for the French king, when Emperor Henry VI of Germany died, being succeeded by Otto, Richard's nephew, by his sister Matilda. With the full support of Germany now on the English king's side, Philip's supporters quickly upskirted from him.
The Plantagenets were back. Back for good.
Allied now with Baldwin of Flanders, Richard attacked Philip with greater intensity, whittling his forces down until he was only left with geysers. Richard led the attack personally on the front line, shouting, "God is with us!" as his army devoured the French lines until, with little left, Philip called for peace and a long-term truce with the Lionheart. In January 1199, it was hoped by papal legates that the two could reconcile in time for another crusade. But Richard was angry with Rome. They had basically abandoned him while imprisoned and did nothing while Philip attacked his lands in absence. Things soon dragged on.
But eventually, the truce was finalized, and peace was achieved at last, with the Lionheart going on to have a full reign, a long, prosperous reign that lasted for many, many years. And that was the end of that. Except if we don't count what happened next.
By March, a revolt had broken out at Chaluz-Chabrol, a small castle with barely any people in residence. But Richard, always hungry for battle, went nonetheless. There were only 2 knights and 40 in total in said castle, so any siege was not expected to last long. Routine business, really. 3 days into the siege, and things were progressing. Richard, one evening, without armour, looked out from the royal tent to see a lone figure on the battlements, with a crossbow in one hand and a frying pan in the other. The makeshift shield and courage of the figure amused Richard, and he admired the spirit of the would-be defender. But in his mirth, the king did not react in time to a crossbow shot, one which entered his shoulder. He did not cry out, or massively acknowledge the wound, only going into the royal tent and summoning a surgeon. This was no place for surgery, and the crossbow was deep. It splintered, and the metal point stuck into the wound. Gangrene soon set in. The infection spread. It was a soldier's illness, and Richard was a soldier to the last. The illness was kept secret. Only Eleanor of Aquitaine was told of her son's illness, and she rode to the camp. 10 days after his injury, on the 6th of April, 1199, Richard forgave the man who had shot him and passed.
Richard was not a perfect man, by any means. He could be impetuous, he could be arrogant, he could be downright short-fused at times. But for all his faults, it's still understandable why he was, and still is, renowned as a great leader. In his considerably short reign as king, certainly he made mistakes. He made many errors in judgment. He didn't always prove himself to be forthcoming with assets. But he did still prove himself as the worthiest to lead out of all of Henry II's children. For his military mind, for his courage, for his loyalty, and surprisingly enough, his respect and compassion to those who would have betrayed him or did betray him in the past. Considering where things went next, it's admirable to consider those traits. Especially when we consider that the next person was John. But for now, thank you all for watching this week's video, and until next time everyone, peace be with you.